Welcome to the Earth Day 2021 Northwoods Land Trust interview with Craig Thompson. Thanks again for joining us. We're going to get together here to talk about a really important wildlife component here in the Northwoods, but also worldwide. My name is Troy Walters. I'm the Outreach and Monitoring Coordinator here at the Northwoods Land Trust. And on the other side of the state, we have Craig Thompson. You want to give a little intro, Craig?
Good morning, Troy, and thank you for inviting me to chat with you about birds this morning. I'm really looking forward to it. My name is Craig Thompson, and I work with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Heritage Conservation, and I am the Chief of Program Integration for that program. The section that I'm responsible for managing entails a broad swath of responsibilities, but particularly as it relates to this, I represent the department on a lot of ongoing bird conservation partnerships, and so I'm happy to bring that perspective to our discussion this morning.
Excellent. I guess one of the things that we really want to explore is kind of the state of birds throughout the world, but also focusing closer to home. We'll kind of wander through some things that the Northwoods Land Trust and other land trusts do to kind of help, and then some things that we can do on a more personal level. So I guess let's get right to this here. If I can get to there. There we go. All right. The first question that we've kind of devised here are what is the current state of bird populations in the world, and then kind of honing in all the way down to Wisconsin and northern Wisconsin. What are your thoughts, Craig?
So I'm going to respond in a very broad context, and that's the state of biodiversity globally, and then focus on birds. So what we know is that the world is experiencing an extinction crisis, and what that means is we are losing species across the globe very rapidly for a variety of reasons, the primary driver of which, however, is habitat loss. Birds happen to be one of the most visible manifestations of this global biodiversity crisis. And we know, because we've over the years been tracking bird population trends for quite some time, that birds are in steep decline in many areas. So if we take a global snapshot, we know there are almost 11,000 species of birds that are found across the planet. Almost 13%, or about 13% of those, which is nearly 1,500 species, are considered to be vulnerable to extinction. And that's not taking into account many still common birds, Troy, that are now in steep decline. So for instance, what I mean is we see robins declining in many areas, and that's a common backyard bird. Another common suburban bird is grackles. And in North America, we've lost 40% of our grackles since 1970. And that speaks to this larger issue of bird declines across North America, which mirror declines across the globe. So we have been counting birds on spring bird surveys. It's called the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Breeding Bird Survey every year since 1970. And that's given us tremendous information to be able to know how many birds in what locations and how they're doing over a period of time. And what we know looking back is we have lost almost 3 billion birds since 1970. Again, a reflection of what's going on in terms of habitat loss across the globe, and particularly in this instance in North America. If we focus on Wisconsin, we see that the same groups of species that are declining across North America, particularly grassland birds, long distance migrants, those being the species like hummingbirds and Baltimore orioles and rose-breasted grosbeaks that actually spend the winter in the tropics, and shorebirds and aerial insectivores, those birds that feed on the wing when they're flying, the swallows, the swifts, the whippoorwills, and so on, are all in precipitous decline. And that's true not only across North America, but also in Wisconsin. And then if we take a closer look at what's going on in northern Wisconsin and the suite of species associated with Wisconsin's spectacular northern forests, we see broad declines for many common species there as well. So for instance, chestnut-sided warblers, which are widely distributed across northern Wisconsin, have declined 42% since 1970. Wood thrushes have declined 60% in Wisconsin. And least flycatcher, which was heretofore one of our most common flycatchers has declined almost 60%. Now, these birds all fall into the category of long distance migrants, meaning they breed in Wisconsin, in North America, specifically in Wisconsin, but they spend the winter in Latin America. And when we look at what's going on land use wise in both places, we recognize that there are double impacts for these species across their hemispheric ranges. What I mean by that is, so here in North America, where birds are suffering from habitat loss and habitat degradation, and then when they go to their wintering grounds, be it in Panama or Guatemala or Costa Rica, or even as far south as perhaps for some species, Argentina, we know that they're also suffering from habitat loss on their wintering grounds as well. What that means then from a practical standpoint is we have enormous challenges associated with developing and implementing hemispheric conservation strategies for these long distance migrants. So suffice it to say, we're dealing with a situation where a large number of species are in significant decline. Birds are a bellwether of what's going on environmentally. And so this is a wake-up call to all of us that something is awry in the environment, and that has implications for our survival on planet Earth. And so we really need to pay attention to birds, and we really need to try to work on their behalf to make the environment as healthy for as many species as possible, including ourselves.
Yeah, I really like how you had said that the things that maybe are impactful up here, but there could also be things that even I know we're going to talk about this later, but things like buying coffee that is oftentimes shipped from South America. There are things that we can do that will help down there as well. So thinking not just around here, but globally is actually pretty important.
Yeah, you're right, Troy. And actually your coffee example, which I know we'll talk about later, is an ideal opportunity for everyone to vote for conservation with their pocketbooks. So what we buy has a huge impact on what goes on in the world.
Right. That's a great perspective. The second question that we're proposing here are other trends observed in bird populations, especially things that are maybe closer to northern Wisconsin. So I guess if you want to take it from there, and I'll add in where appropriate.
So eastern forest birds and northern forest birds are, generally speaking, also in decline. But it depends on the species, some more so than others. You have a slide up of evening grosbeaks, this spectacular Boreal Finch that typically we only see in Wisconsin during the winters because they breed up in Boreal Canada. That's a species that has declined 90% since 1970. It's very disturbing to know that this once abundant, beautiful bird is now becoming increasingly rare. And what's going on up in Canada has a great, in terms of habitat loss and alteration, is probably having a significant impact on this species. In terms of things like boreal chickadees or the crossbills, the other species that you have up, the climate is changing and it is becoming warmer. And as climate warms, that's affecting these birds to the point where some of them are now beginning to experience range retractions northward. Another example of that is a golden wing warbler, a species that's particularly important to Wisconsin right now. The bulk of golden wing warblers, this beautiful little warbler that breed the primary breeding grounds for this species is Minnesota and Wisconsin, and a little bit of Appalachia down in the southeast states, believe it or not. But the bulk, the 65% of the global population of those birds breed here and in adjacent Minnesota. What we're seeing based on climate prediction models is that species may begin to rapidly retract northward and lose ultimately its breeding range in Wisconsin and become a Canada resident almost exclusively based on some models. Now, we don't know if that's going to be true or not, but we do know that climate change is beginning to impact where species live. And so we're monitoring these things very closely. On the left side of your screen, you've got two species that you pointed out in our conversation before we got started are becoming increasingly common up in northern Wisconsin. So years ago, it was a really big deal to find a cardinal. And you had just mentioned that you had a colleague who found a cardinal outside of singing in Eagle River of all places, just within the last week or so. The birds just below it are red-bellied woodpeckers, another traditionally southern species that is rapidly expanding its range north. And I think another species that's perhaps doing that as well is tufted titmouse, which is an oak hickory forest associate that appears to be expanding its range northward. So range contractions to the north for those northern boreal or transition forest associated species that really like it, need it colder, and then range expansions to the north for these more southern associated birds that we typically think of as being more common in southern Wisconsin are now becoming more so in northern Wisconsin. So it's a very a lot of things in play, a lot of dynamic changes for birds are underway across vast landscapes as the climate continues to warm and other weather events continue to have an impact.
Right. I think a lot of people too are under the impression that if, it's really, maybe it's not that big of a deal because, right, the birds the northern boreal birds are just going further north, right? Like they can just find what they need further north, right? So they can just replace what they have with going north. Is that like a direct comparison?
Well, so that suggestion holds as long as there's adequate habitat available. So if if their ranges are contracting to the north and they're contracting into suitable habitat, those birds can probably hang on for a period of time. However, if the climate continues to warm and even those habitats become less suitable for those species and they move north and there's nowhere to go, there's no suitable habitat available, then we start to bump up against the loss of habitat as one of the primary drivers of bird decline. It's one of the best examples is what's going on down in the tropics, in the tropical Andes of Northwest South America. So in Venezuela and Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, where due to climate change, they're watching birds rapidly shift their ranges upslope. So a species that may have traditionally inhabited the foot of the tropical Andes in Colombia is now halfway up the mountain. And those birds can keep doing that as long as the vegetation is there to support them. But at some point, you're on the tip of the mountain and there is no vegetation. You've just run out of suitable habitat. So big changes underway. And to the extent that we can begin to address this climate change situation in earnest and try to turn things around, that's just going to be better for everyone, including ourselves.
Excellent. So this question kind of revolves around basically what are things like IBAs, important bird areas, and land trusts on more of a larger landscape style conservation effort. How are they able to play into bird conservation?
Well, that's a great question, Troy. So IBAs is conservation shorthand for important bird area. And if we look at all of Wisconsin or all of the United States and try to understand where the most important places are for birds, we can begin to draw lines around certain habitat types in certain areas, recognizing that those areas hold extremely high value for birds. We've done it in Wisconsin. We've actually identified 93 areas that are a cut above every place else as it relates to birds and bird conservation. We've designated those as important bird areas using this concept that was actually created by BirdLife International, an organization that's based in England, but that has a broad global program. And back in 1985, they said, you know what, we're losing bird habitats in Europe. We know we can't protect everything. Let's protect the most important areas for birds. And so they gave rise to, they actually created the Important Bird Area Program, which has now become global. So if you look on the map on the left, you can see these green polygons. Those polygons are a subset of the 93 important bird areas that span the state of Wisconsin. These happen to be those embedded within the northern region, all of which have high value for birds. And if you look to the right, you can see Northwoods Land Trust protected properties, both properties that have been purchased by the Northwoods Land Trust and others that have been eased through permanent conservation easements. And you see how they relate to those crosshatch polygons, which are the important bird areas. And what we know is that land trusts play an extremely critical role for biodiversity conservation in Wisconsin, and particularly for birds, because land trusts are working primarily with private landowners. If we take a look at ownership across the state, Troy, we know that about 85% of Wisconsin is privately owned. And what that means is, in order for us to really positively impact the future of birds and, in a greater sense, biodiversity in the state of Wisconsin, private landowners have a critically important role to play. And there are no organizations that are better positioned to work with private landowners on biodiversity conservation and bird conservation than land trusts. And so the work that you guys are doing as the Northwoods Land Trust in northern Wisconsin is vitally important for all kinds of reasons, including the future of birds in our state.
Yeah, I think that is really an important connection to make is, those little blue polygons on the right-hand map, those are permanently protected. Those are lands that those conservation values, were determined and agreed upon, and yeah, those will be protected forever. The IBAs have really no official designation, and while they're likely to be continue to be protected, most likely because they're hard to get to or publicly owned, that's not guaranteed. Those green and blue ones are. So that's
Yeah,
kind of nice.
that's a really good point, Troy. And if you look at just how the map is starting to how the blues and the greens and the crosshatch polygons are beginning with, based on Northwoods Land Trust efforts, are beginning to coalesce, you're really working in important buffer zones adjacent to those important bird areas. So the habitat within the IBA is extremely important for birds, but what goes on adjacent to that IBA is also vitally important for birds. And so you're working in these critical buffer zones. And you're also in the process, in many instances, of expanding the protected areas or creating landscape linkages between these important areas to allow birds and other wildlife to move back and forth. So from what I can tell based on your efforts, it looks like you guys are just doing a terrific job of protecting really important habitats in Wisconsin's northern forest. And we are very appreciative of that and all the great things that you have accomplished.
Thanks very much. So the last question that we had are, we've kind of went, large scale all the way down now to individuals, and what are some things that we can do to help impact birds and bird populations?
So the loss of birds is so significant that it requires all of us to get involved. And I just want to underscore the urgency of this. This is an all hands on deck endeavor. We really need everyone to step up and make decisions in their lives that are good for the future of the planet. And one way to do that is by working on behalf of birds. And so if we take a look at the seven simple actions graphic, and you look at the lower left, Troy, it says, drink shade-grown coffee. You had alluded to that earlier. There are two ways that coffee is made in the tropics. One way is in full sun, where the tropical forest is completely removed, and those full sun coffee plantations are often drenched in pesticides and fertilizers. They're high hazard environments with virtually no habitat value, either for resident species and particularly for migratory birds. Another way to grow coffee is in shade, and that can be very productive for native wildlife in Guatemala, for instance, and also for the myriad songbirds from Wisconsin and other parts of the Midwest, which rely on tropical forests in Guatemala for survival. If they can't find a tropical forest, shade coffee plantations are the next best bet. And a well-managed shade coffee plantation provides tremendous habitat benefits. So we, as consumers, can wake up every morning and start each day with a cup of conservation by drinking shade-grown coffee, and just as a part of our daily routine, be actively contributing to the conservation of our migratory songbirds. The next one is reduce plastic use. And of course, plastic use is a problem everywhere, but particularly in the oceans. And so we know, to the extent that we reduce the use of plastic, as opposed to just saying, hey, I'm going to use it and recycle it, well, those recycling markets are very unpredictable and uncertain. And so the best thing we can possibly do is just reduce the use of plastics and get those plastics out of our environment. Citizen science is a great way to help know what's going on in terms of birds, not only in your backyard, but in neighborhood parks and so on. And Troy, maybe you want to speak a little bit about eBird in that regard.
Sure, yeah. eBird is a Cornell Lab of Ornithology citizen science program where every bird that is cited and documented through eBird can actually be used by researchers, whether it's biologists or whoever, that actually can use some of that information to um, predict population trends or habitat preferences or whatever. So it's kind of more than just log. I mean, it's good to log your own list and things like that, which is a lot of people enjoy doing that. But it's also can benefit science as well, which I think is a really cool connection for eBird with science.
Yeah, that's a great summary. And I eBird as well as do most of the people I know. And so it's just an easy, fun way to keep track of what's going on in your yard birdwise and contribute to this larger body of knowledge that helps us understand what's going on out there. If you look just above the wood thrush, you see something that says make windows safe. If we look at the primary drivers of bird decline in North America, the #1 driver of bird declines is habitat loss. The second driver of bird declines is collisions with windows. It's estimated that up to 1 billion birds a year die by flying into windows. They simply can't see the window. And so they're flying through and they think nothing's there. They hit the window and they die. And that's an easily remedied situation by just simply modifying the outside of your window so that reflective surface is broken up, and it gives the birds pause and they literally avoid it. I want to point people to a website that is worthy of consideration if you have window strike problems, and honestly most folks do, because birds are everywhere and windows are everywhere. It's a go to birdsavers.com and look at something that's called Zen Window Curtains. They're really easy to make and they're highly effective. And I put them on the outside of all of our windows at home, and our window strikes have gone down from many a year and lots of casualties to almost nothing. So I've been very happy with the result. And even if people are a little bit reluctant because, gosh, we're not sure what it's going to look like and we don't know if we want to go to the trouble, here's my suggestion. Identify that worst window in your house. Identify that one window where you're constantly hearing the thud of birds as they're flying against it and dying or injuring themselves, and treat that one window and see what a difference that makes. And then as you become more comfortable with it, then perhaps you'll take it upon yourself to do your other windows as well. You can have an enormous impact almost instantaneously. It's really good for birds. Keep cats outdoors. That's the little wood thrush in the 7 simple actions graphic is actually shouting at that cat to stay inside. You can see the cat outlined. Cats are wonderful animals. They're also highly effective predators. When they're outside, it's problematic because they instinctually hunt everything that's out there. And it's thought that 500 million birds a year are probably dying as a result of cats roaming around outside. So again, this is something that's very easy for us to control in terms of reducing that source of mortality simply by keeping the cats indoors. And honestly, it's much healthier for your cat. They're not going to be bumping up against all those nasty things that are, getting hit by trucks or cars, being chased by coyotes, picking up all kinds of diseases as they're roaming around and scat from other animals and bringing those diseases into the house. So healthier for kitty, better for birds. It's a really easy one. Use native plants. To the extent that we plant native plants in our yard, it's going to be really good for everything, including insects and particularly birds. There was a study that was done out east recently in the suburbs of Virginia, and what they found is that if yards had less than 70% native vegetation, birds are typically unable to successfully reproduce in them because they can't find enough food to feed their babies. So by extension, what that means is in our yards, we want to encourage people to plant as much native vegetation, plants, shrubs, trees as possible. And in fact, going just by that rule of thumb from the study out east, 7 out of 10 things you plant in your yard should be native, because that's what it's going to take to sustain bird populations in suburban and urban landscapes. Another thing that we can do that's instantly gratifying, We did it in our yard. The response we got from birds has been overwhelmingly positive. And a lot of people are saying, gosh, that looks really beautiful. How did you do that? So I'm happy to share that information with our neighbors and encourage them to begin planting. And once you have entire neighborhoods that start doing that, then you're really leveraging people's ability to impact bird populations in a positive way. So native plants, easy, hardy, beautiful, good for birds and other wildlife. And then finally, avoid pesticides. Pesticides are proving to be a significant thorny issue. Suffice it to say, if you don't need to use them, we don't need more of them in the environment. They're contributing to significant declines in insects. And when the insects disappear, the birds have nothing to eat. And by extension, the birds are disappearing. So it's all about food chain support. So really try to avoid, or at minimum, reduce your use of pesticides in your yards and in other places.
Yeah, that's great. There's a couple things that I think are kind of interesting to add to that discussion. And I think this is speaking accurately for just to kind of go back just for a quick minute to the shade grown coffee issue. From my understanding is that these some of the larger plantations, you know, with kind of things grown year after year after year, the nutrients start to leach out through the soil, and that soil actually becomes less able to grow things in the future. So it can be longer lasting than you would think than, oh, let's just keep growing the coffee in the same location. It's not that big of a deal, but those areas become less productive if I'm understanding things right.
You're right, and you described it perfectly, Troy. So the sun coffee plantations over time become biological dead zones, and as the soil capability to support coffee diminishes, the inclination is to go into new forested areas and create new sun coffee plantations and just abandon the old one. And you can see the cycle of destruction, and that leads to a significant snowballing loss of habitat, which is oh so important for many species. I notice you've got a golden wing warbler just to the right of the 7 simple actions graphic, and that species is particularly, as I had mentioned, is particularly important in Wisconsin. We have more than 40% of the no, excuse me, we have more than 25% of the world's breeding population of golden wing warblers. They winter in the same elevation as coffee plantations are found in Latin America. And so shade coffee plantations are particularly important for the survival of this iconic, beautiful species of long distance migrant that sets up shop in Wisconsin every year. So shade grown coffee, huge impact, something we can do every day.
Right. The other kind of thing I thought was interesting about making your windows safer is you can truly make the window safer itself, or a lot of times or not a lot of times, some of the time the strikes may be due to the placement of where your bird feeders are versus like on the window versus a certain distance away. Can you just briefly talk on placement of bird feeders?
So, yeah, so placement of bird feeders, and Troy, you're going to have to chime in here. I'm trying to remember exactly what the parameters are, but I think if your bird feeder, you're better having the bird feeder very close to the window as opposed to having it, or either really far away or very close, as to having it in like the 20-30 feet. Because what happens is if you have your bird feeder 20 or 30 feet away from your window, and of course we feed birds because we want to watch them because that's fun, we do it at home, and so I completely get it. But when those hawks come in, and you're going to get a concentration of birds at any bird feeder, hawks are going to find them, hawks are going to fly in, they're going to scare the birds. And if your feeder is really close to the window, like 3 feet away or 4 feet away, most of the time the birds are going to try to just fly away from the window. And if they do hit it, they haven't accelerated to the point where they're likely going to sustain life-threatening injuries. But if they're that distance, like 20, 25, 30 feet away, you're going to have a lot of birds bouncing off the windows and perhaps dying. You know, the other solution is to put them way out away from the house, which gives the birds a lot of comfort if it's in good habitat and you simply watch with binoculars. A little more challenge to get out there and fill the feeder, particularly in the winter, but again, you reduce the likelihood that you're going to have birds dying on your windows. Is that, Troy, are those the distance parameters that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I think it's close. Like anything 6 feet or closer is probably pretty good. And then, like you said, pretty far away. I don't know that there's an actual distance that I'm aware of, but
Yeah,
yeah, just really, like you said, really close, or, it doesn't have to be where you need binoculars to see the birds, but you don't want to have them like 8 feet away or something. Then, like you said, they can accelerate the wrong direction, especially if you have two windows in your houses that line up with each other. They think they can go right through that slot in the trees, and
I've
then they
seen that.
really
You're right.
hit them going fast. So,
Yep, I've seen that time and time again where the birds just think they can fly through the windows. And I would just to loop back, Troy, to what we had discussed earlier, even if you do move your feeders closer, you're still, just because of the concentration of birds and the way things happen at bird feeders, you're likely to experience collisions. So I would suggest, considering feeder placement, but also still treating that window that you're looking out of with some kind of application that's going to break up that reflective surface so the birds don't think they can fly through it. Just a one point, so we treated all of our windows with Zen Window Curtains, and you can learn how to make those at birdsavers.com. And we actually had friends who came up to the house and saw them for the first time, didn't know what they were for, and said, "Oh, that's kind of neat. Did you have an architect do that for you?" And so my point is that aesthetically, and that's the big concern with these kinds of window treatments, is, well, how is it going to look, and will I be able to see through it? Aesthetically, those Zen window curtains they're ideal because they're almost invisible both from the inside and from the outside, and they really work very well.
right. I did want to give a quick shout out to Laura Erickson, who provided all the pictures for us to use. So that was great of her to do that. And I know that she also has recommendations on other types of, like you said, window treatments. There's some sort of like almost like a tape you can buy where you can see out the window perfectly fine, and it just breaks up the pattern so that, looking in, they see something that does not appear to be a perfectly clean pathway to get through. So,
Yeah, there are a number of things that you can do. It's whatever you feel most comfortable with and whatever works for your individual situation. And I do appreciate Laura providing. Laura's a tremendous, she's a fount of knowledge in regard to birds and a tremendous bird advocate. I appreciate her contributions of these wonderful images. And to the extent that people are willing to go to her website, take a look and learn more about birds and how to do good things on behalf, I think that's terrific. Another good source of how to treat your windows for birds is go to the American Bird Conservancy's website, abcbirds.org, and take a look at their window collisions page, and they have all kinds of suggestions as to what you may be able to do given your individual situation as well. So there are resources out there that are readily accessible to anyone who is willing to take this problem on, and what a great impact, no pun intended, you can have in a positive way.
right. Excellent. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for today. I mean, you and I could both talk much longer
We could,
about
in
birds,
fact.
but I think we'll call it good for the day here. And yeah, hopefully this was informational and people can, kind of get an idea of where birds are at and things we can do to help. So thanks very much, Craig.
And thank you, Troy, for the opportunity to chat with you about birds today. I encourage everyone to get involved to the extent that they can. Birds need our help. And I do want to express appreciation for the wonderful work that the Northwoods Land Trust is doing in northern Wisconsin. You're protecting extremely important bird habitats. It really matters. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Craig.